Hello, I'm Michael Cantrell, and you are listening to the Prison Officer Podcast, a place to have a conversation about the forgotten cops that work in this country's jails, prisons, and correctional centers. A place for me to try to make sense of a career spent working inside the fence with some of the greatest people that nobody sees or recognizes for the important job they do to keep this world safe. If you love this podcast, hit the follow button, or better yet, share with your family, friends, or coworkers. In more than 28 years of corrections, I have used or supervised PepperBall hundreds of times. Now, as a master instructor for PepperBall, I teach others about the versatility and effectiveness of the PepperBall system. From cell extractions to disturbances on the rec yard, PepperBall is the first option in my correctional toolbox. With ranges up to 150 feet and hoppers that can hold 160 rounds, PepperBall is perfect for controlling large crowds or group disturbances on your yard. PepperBall allows for non-lethal direct impact to control inmates who refuse to comply with lawful orders, and area saturation allows you to achieve buffer zones between groups, or use it for area denial to keep inmates away from security equipment and other accessible areas. To learn more about PepperBall, go to www.pepperball.com or click the link below in this show's information guide. PepperBall is the safer option first. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their powers from the consent of the governed. Welcome back to the Prison Officer Podcast. Most Americans are familiar with these statements from their high school civics course. Well, I guess high school students are still taught civics, maybe not, but most correctional officers have at one time or another wondered about their job and their belief in the above statements. How can we as correctional officers deprive someone of their freedom? How can we sometimes take their life? Do we believe that these are unalienable rights? Do we believe that all men are created equal? Well, first and foremost, I have never taken someone's freedom. I work for the government that the American people put into place as a group. And yes, I do not care who you are in this country. You have to take responsibility for the part you play in our government. Even those of you who refuse to participate, which is your right, but you are the most to blame for the problems in this country, in my opinion. Your lack of participation in this government causes more problems than it cures. Your individual rights, including rights to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, can only be taken from you legally by the government. Now, that's not saying that those rights cannot be also taken from you by criminals, but that's another part of this story, and it is the essence of what our justice system is charged to preserve. Do you believe that all men are created equal? And I'm not talking about race, religion, or disability. I'm questioning the assumption that the murderer and the mother have the same rights. Should the pedophile and the soldier be treated the same? Should all inmates be treated the same? I keep having this discussion with people, and no one seems to get it. And the reason they don't get it is because they're protected from the truth of it. And what I'm talking about is the notion that all inmates deserve rehabilitation, that all inmates should be treated equally, that all inmates have the ability to someday be a good neighbor, and the idea that with enough money and remedial classes, everyone can be a productive member of society. Well, wake up, people. In reality, there is a portion of the inmate population that doesn't want a 9-to-5 job. They don't want a house in the suburbs with a mortgage. They don't want a minivan. They don't want church socials. They don't want corn dogs at the local fair. And they don't want Social Security when they turn 65. They don't want your life. They want power. They want money. They want to control others. These are narcissistic, immoral, murderous, evil inmates. I have seen them kill each other for no more than a slight disrespect or even just a cigarette. They're not your friends, and they don't care about you. Your life is nothing more than a pawn on a chessboard to them. So, not all inmates are the same, but not all prisons are the same. Some inmates need to be segregated, and others do not. There are inmates in our prison systems who should never be let out of restrictive housing, and that's a contention in our country. A lot of people don't believe or think they don't believe in restrictive housing. I believe in restrictive housing, and I'll tell you why. But first, let's start with what restrictive housing is. I got this from the National Institute of Corrections. Restrictive housing, sometimes known as administrative segregation, is the practice of housing some inmates separately from the general population of a correctional institution and imposing restrictions on their movement, behavior, and privileges. The public perception seems to be that inmates end up in restrictive housing and that correctional staff do it by some kind of lottery. Well, someone doesn't just yell, bingo, you're going to the hole. Restrictive housing is based on many factors, and it takes a lot of effort on the inmate's part to get there. Every prison system does it different, and I can't talk to all of them. But when you are convicted and you go to prison, you are classified. And we do that, and we monitor that classification, and we adjust that classification throughout your time in prison. But we classify inmates because we have to determine the best way to keep not only that inmate safe, but the other inmates in the prison. And of course, we also try to keep staff safe. And this is done by looking at, several factors. I'll talk about some of these. Racial background or ethnicity is one that we're going to look to. Prison officials try to keep a racial balance in the institutions. Prisons are racist places, so we try to keep a balance in there. If we get too many white inmates, too many black inmates, too many Hispanic inmates, they're not in there for the volleyball leagues. They're in there for control. They want to run the drugs. They want to run the prostitution that goes on in prison. This is what inmates, especially in our higher level penitentiaries, this is the life that they have in there. And like it or not, people could say that there is racism, that there isn't racism. In prison, there is a lot of racism when it comes to violence, when it comes to fights, when it comes to gang fights. Now, the interesting thing is that when it comes to making money, a lot of these extremely racist inmates will lay all that hate and stuff to the side if they can work together to get drugs or alcohol in, or if they can make more money working together. So that's always an interesting dynamic to watch. But that's just one of the things we're going to look at. We're also going to look at a person's age. A younger person has more energy, can often be more violent. Lots of us, including myself, as you get older, I don't know, some of us get slower, but some of us, I think we get a little bit more perspective in life. I'm not as prone to being aggravated or for someone to, get my dander up over some comments. It takes a lot more to get me to display any type of violence. And that works the same with inmates. We're going to look at their criminal offense. Why are they serving time? The guy that stole from the bank that was a teller, and the guy that walked into the bank with a gun and shot somebody to steal money from the bank. Well, those are two different types of criminals, and we're going to treat them differently. One is more violent, one is more prone to violence. So we need to separate them. How long before they get out? That's one of the things we take a look at. How long before they're released from prison? The guy that's got a couple of months to the door isn't as likely to try to escape or get in trouble as the guy who's got 30 or 40 years and doesn't ever see an end to it. Those inmates tend to be more violent, and they have less to, I guess they think they have less to live for, is maybe the reason. We're going to look at their criminal history. We're going to see what they've done in their past. What type of criminal history? Is this a bank robber? Is it a murderer? Is it a drug dealer that's never had any violence? What type of criminal history does this inmate have? We're going to look at history of escape attempts. If you've had past escape attempts, you're going to go to a more secure prison. That's just the way life is. And probably every time you try to escape, you're going to go to a more and more and more secure prison. So some of that's directly, that's an example of when inmates are directly responsible for how they're treated or whether or not they're in restrictive housing. Do they have a detainer? When they get released, is there another agency waiting to pick them up on some other charge? That would take a look at it. Education level. Well, why should education level have anything to do with it? Well, studies for years and years and decades have shown that the higher the education level, the less likely someone is to be a criminal, or at least to be a violent criminal. And so that's why education's pushed so hard once an individual goes to prison. We're going to look at past drug and alcohol abuse. Is this a person who makes good decisions? Is this a person who's controlled by their addiction? A person who's controlled by their addiction cannot be trusted to make good decisions for their future. So they may be more willing to do things that another person wouldn't if they have that addiction. There's a lot of things that go into it. Are you a member of a disruptive group? Are you a sex offender? Are you a deportable alien? What's your sentence length? Have you ever participated in a prison disturbance? Do you have a history of juvenile violence? Do you have a history of telephone abuse can affect your custody level? And there's a lot of stuff taken into consideration. We don't just drop them into prison without a lot of thought and work. And they're monitored throughout their time to see if any of those factors change, to see if they become more violent. And if they do, they require more security. And that's going to get them in places that are more similar to what we're talking about with restrictive housing. We're also going to look at their family ties. Is this a person who communicates with their, they call their mom every week on the phone? Do they talk to their wife and children? I knew a lot of inmates who, worked unicorn jobs, and they would take big chunks of their paycheck and send it home so that their kids would have something for Christmas or their birthday coming up. And then I've seen inmates who get on the phone with several different women who, and I don't know that they are, but this is what I hear on the phone, that they are drawing government checks, food stamps and stuff like that. And then he's trying to talk these people into sending him money into the prison, even though his kids out there depend on, that government handout. So 2 different types of inmates. As I said, not all inmates are created equal. There's so many parts to this story. And if you're a civilian out there, you don't see any of it. And it's not represented well by the media. The only thing you hear from the media is the inmate who says, I was treated bad. These guys were miserable to me and they took my freedom and they did this and they treated me like this. That's all you hear from the media. In the movies, correctional officers, and it's not just correctional officers, but in the movies and media, correctional officers are shown as horrible people. But they also show inmates in a bad light. The other part of the story is, there's inmates who just want to do their time and go home. There are 2 types of inmates. Those who cause problems and those who just want to do their time and go home. Those inmates want a better life. They do want a chance to be productive in society. I applaud and I support those inmates who have decided, to turn their life around. But once again, public perception is that put the inmate in jail, put that violent inmate in jail, and everyone will be safe. I am one of the people who keep them locked away where they cannot hurt you. That does not mean that they cannot hurt others, though. They still cause chaos, pain, and violence. They just do it behind a fence where you can't see them. They still kill and they still prey on other people. They still kill the staff assigned to protect you from them. We have inmates who are still very dangerous, locked behind bars. Letting a violent inmate out of restrictive housing makes it harder on the other inmates. When we don't control those violent inmates, the prison yard is a dangerous place to live for those inmates, for all the other inmates. Those inmates don't get their chance to program. They don't get access to classes, work, or religious services. Why? Well, because the prison is locked down. Everyone loses when those violent inmates are turned loose on the yard. The only way to keep everyone safe is to prevent those inmates from having access to more victims. And I looked around, I couldn't find anything more recent, but I think these numbers are probably right on the mark still. But according to a 2013 study, 46 officers were killed by inmates in this nation between 1999 and 2008. Think about that. 46. And that does not include the 43 staff suicides that happened during the same period. Almost 100 officers, and 46 of them were killed by inmates. You know, apparently these numbers don't mean much to politicians and administrators who continue to try to take away the use of restrictive housing. Before taking office, President Biden pledged to overhaul the federal prison system, ending the practice of solitary confinement. The terms solitary confinement and restrictive housing are another area where those outside of prison have very little understanding. Restrictive housing is the practice of housing some inmates separately from the general population. Solitary confinement is a form of imprisonment in which an incarcerated person lives in a single cell with little or no contact with other people. These are two totally different things. We have inmates who want to live by themselves. This is never in the studies, but a lot of inmates do not want to live with other inmates. And therefore, every time we let them out, and if they're in solitary confinement, every time we let them out, they attack other inmates. And they do this so much to the point that we're forced to sell them by themselves. They cannot be sold with anyone else. That was not the prison administration's choice. Most prisons are short on staff and bed space and would be happy to house inmates outside of restrictive housing or solitary confinement. Restrictive housing and solitary confinement are both staff-intensive methods for housing inmates. It costs taxpayers 3, 4, even 5 times as much to house an inmate in restrictive housing as it does to let them out in general population. So when I hear that prisons like restrictive housing or prisons like solitary confinement, I have to laugh. With recruitment at an all-time low and budgets getting squeezed every year, there is not an administrator who wouldn't prefer to house all inmates in general population. Yet, a lot of inmate advocacy groups lump these definitions together because it brings up images in most people's minds of dungeons with chains on the wall. They want the public to imagine the worst possible conditions. Yet the truth is, inmates in restrictive housing and inmates in solitary confinement, by law, have 3 showers per week, 3 meals a day, laundry exchange weekly, mail and telephone privileges, unless they've been sanctioned, unless they did something to lose those. They have toothbrushes. Now they are cut short to keep the inmate from making weapons from them and stabbing each other or stabbing a staff member. They have soap. They have shampoo. They're allowed to even shave with a razor, although staff have tracking measures in place to ensure the inmate doesn't steal the razor blade to make a weapon. Do you see a pattern here? It's not on the officer. We keep having to put these measures in place because of the inmate's behavior. But the number one thing about restrictive housing, it is the choice of the inmate. Most of them can get out of restrictive housing when they choose to. I'd say except for the ones who we have to put into protective custody because they're high profile, they got high publicity. Other than that, almost every other inmate can stop being violent to others. They can stop making weapons. They can stop making prison hooch. They can accept responsibility for their actions. And when they do something wrong, they can make it right with others. Stop lying and manipulating others. It's actually really easy to stay out of the hole. Hell, it's actually pretty easy to stay out of prison altogether. But the decisions they make determine where they are, not where they grew up, not who their parents were. I know a lot of people who've grown up in horrible conditions, and they're making a difference in the world right now, daily. I also know a lot of people who had everything handed to them, and they are blowing it daily with poor decisions. Our politicians, though, it seems like they understand very little of this. And that's why we see legislation like the End Solitary Confinement Act. Under this act, inmates and detainees would not be segregated alone for more than a maximum of 4 hours in order to de-escalate an emergency situation, and even then, staff would be required to meet with them at least once an hour. Incarcerated people will also be ensured access to at least 14 hours of daily time out of their cells, including access to 7 hours of programming meant to address topics such as mental health, substance abuse, and violence prevention. These politicians act like they know what's going on in prison, but they've never walked a day inside. Every once in a while, one of them it'll tour a prison, but I've been through this dog and pony show. I'm sure you have too. When the politician gets there, we lock all the inmates down. We go pick out 3 or 4 of the best ones for them to talk to. And then the politician or whoever stands out on the empty yard. They pat the warden on the back for bringing jobs to the area and talk to those 4 inmates, and then they leave. Then they make some prepared statement in the parking lot about how we should end, restrictive housing. And they think they know what prison is all about. Well, I invite them. Let them walk into a segregation unit and let them see the violent inmates that are in restrictive or solitary housing. And let them understand why it is necessary to keep them there. General Colin Powell said once, 90% of my time is spent on 10% of the world. You know what? The same goes for prison. I'm all for having discussions on how we make our justice system, our prisons, and our communities safer. But before we can have a meaningful discussion about prisons, we have to separate the inmates we're talking about. The inmate who has become mixed up in drugs or gangs, but has a real desire to change their life. I am interested in giving those inmates the resources to become better neighbors, to give them the hand they need to be a productive part of society. But they are the 90%. In prison and in jails, we spend most of our taxpayer-funded budgets, and we spend it on the worst 10% of the inmates. These violent, narcissistic, immoral inmates who only want power and control over others should be confined in such a manner that they never have the opportunity to hurt another person. That includes other inmates and jail and prison staff. They are the 10%, and I'm tired of spending all our money on them. I'm tired of losing correctional staff. An example I can think of pretty quickly. There used to be a federal inmate named Clayton Fountain. He has passed away. He went to prison because he murdered his drill instructor. I believe it was the Marines. It could have been the Army. I think he was in the Marines. Murdered his drill instructor and took some people hostage. So the courts, the justice system, and their wizened approach to justice, they decided that they should put him in prison for life. Well, that gave him the opportunity during that time to kill 2 inmates. Now, I don't know anything about those 2 inmates he killed, but they may have been some of the inmates that, wanted to have a better life, that would have gotten out and been a good neighbor. But they didn't get that opportunity because our justice system let a murderer go to prison and kill more people. But he didn't stop there. Before he was done, he killed a federal corrections officer. At what point do we say enough is enough? We cannot treat all inmates the same. Some of those inmates are dangerous. Some of those inmates are dangerous to the people who you have charged in protecting you. So all I ask is that you stand up for those people who work day in, day out, 24/7 to keep the violent people behind the fence, to keep the boogeyman out of your house so that you can go to sleep every night. Stand up against our justice system and our politicians and our administrators who want to turn these violent inmates out on the yard so that they can prey on people again. Not all inmates are created equal. This is Mike Cantrell. Thank you for listening to the Prison Officer Podcast. Have a great day. I would like to take a minute to thank one of our sponsors that make the Prison Officer Podcast possible. OMNI RTLS is a company that I've been working with for the last year. I am proud to be part of this team of correctional professionals who have developed the best real-time locating system on the market today. With OMNI's real-time location technology, you automatically know the accurate locations and interactions of all inmates, staff, and assets anywhere in your correctional facility, and you have this information in real time. OMNI is cutting-edge software for today's jails and prisons. It is the only way to monitor every square inch of your facility while still being PREA compliant. Go to www.omnirtls for more information and to make your facility safer today. That's www.omnirtls.com. If you enjoy these podcasts, the best way to support the Prisoner Officer Podcast is to share these episodes with your friends or family on social media. Let me invite you to visit www.theprisonofficer.com. If you haven't already, check out the Prison Officer Podcast on Facebook and click that little follow button. Or leave us a message, or better yet, leave us a review. And if you're listening to us on Apple Podcast, Google, or Spotify, please click the subscribe button. Until next time, I'm Mike Cantrell. Watch your back, and please take care of each other out there behind those walls.